Hey, Cypher here, coming at you with another class lecture. This is from my first half of American History Survey. I've cut out the pauses and all the ers and ums and all that kind of stuff, and added a little bit of background music, but otherwise it is just a standard lecture. But I know a lot of people actually enjoy that. The War of 1812 and the Indian Wars were fought during the early Republic. They could be seen as part of a larger conflict often called the 60 Years' War for the Great Lakes region, which began with the French and Indian War in 1754 and had nearly continuous conflict all the way into the early 19th century. As such, one cannot completely survey all of the events of this time frame and all of the wars and whatnot without spending more time than we have here. This is necessarily incomplete, but this week covers contests over the sovereignty of the United States, Britain, and the various tribes during what's called the Eastern Treaty Period, as in when the United States was still making treaties with Eastern tribes. That would end roughly in 1831. These wars would result in the creation of the U.S. Army, the consolidation of American politics, the beginning of industrialization in the United States, and ultimately define the antagonism between the U.S. and the various tribes in which it claimed sovereignty over. By the time of the American Revolution, the colonies turned states pretty much successfully laid claim to all the lands that they currently occupy today through conquest and negotiation. But the result of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 pushed that claim all the way to the Mississippi. Most of eastern Pennsylvania and upstate New York were still recognized as Indian land at this time. In the South, there were the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called at the time. They were generally characterized by working with Southerners to create agricultural societies, often descendant from mound builders of old, although the Seminoles in Florida were still mostly hunter-gatherers, but they were also outside of the United States, for the most part. Though by the end of this, they wouldn't be. Cherokees, just over the mountains from Georgia and the Carolinas, were the most powerful of these 5 tribes. Chickasaws and Choctaws held most of the land that is now Mississippi and Alabama. Creeks, or Muskogee as they call themselves, were largely in southwestern Georgia and what is now eastern Alabama. Finally, the Seminoles in Florida were the most isolated due to the fact that Florida had just recently switched back to being Spanish, and they had not pushed very deep into the interior. In the Northwest, a series of confederacies would form between the tribes, the most powerful of which was the Iroquois League, a confederacy of 6 nations in and of itself, and they call themselves the Haudenosaunee. During the Revolutionary War, their leader, Joseph Brant, a Mohawk, had actually fought as a loyalist, but that did not work out for the Iroquois, when Washington sent a brutal campaign to end their support. Brant in turn started going west to form a pan-Indian alliance, much like Pontiac before him. But unlike Pontiac, this alliance was largely defensive, in order to defend their own sovereignty from U.S. expansion. By 1783, most of the alliances were in place, and with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix a year later and a series of other treaties after that, the U.S. gained more and more territory through cessions from the Iroquois League, with the Treaty of Fort McIntosh largely creating the borders of what the Northwest Confederacy would be. The tribes typically included in these confederacies were the Wyandot, or Huron, Miamis, or Illinois, Shawnees, and another sub-confederation called the Council of 3 Fires, which was made up of the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes. Leadership in the Northwest Confederacy, though initially completely led by Joseph Brant and Iroquois' succession, would steadily shift southwest to Miamis and eventually Shawnees. The 5 civilized tribes in the Northwest Confederacy were powerful enough to stand a chance at resisting American aggression, hence why the initial interaction with these tribes was mostly peaceful. An informal fur trade had been the driving economic basis of the colonies long before the United States. And although agriculture and the global trading system would eventually supplant it in economic primacy, the fur trade eventually became more systematized, starting with the factory system as it was called in 1697. These were essentially trading outposts where merchants would bring in manufactured goods to trade with Indians for pelts. This is why there were so many forts dotted throughout the frontier. In 1790, the fledgling Congress started passing a series of legislation that would go on for another century, called the Indian Intercourse Acts, or Non-Intercourse Acts, which regulated how the United States would interact with the various tribes. It specified that state governments could not buy land officially held in reservation by the United States, and acts after 1790 would eventually eliminate many forms of trade. The one in 1796 officially sanctioned the factory system and subsidized it. The system would work pretty well until 1822, when Congress outlawed liquor sales to Indians, an important manufactured good for the factory system. That 1822 law would lead to private fur trapping companies rather than relying on Indian sales. To foster that economic system, the U.S. had to standardize the treaty system. As early as 1778 with the Treaty of Fort Pitt, the United States had been treating with tribes, in that case Delawares, who became fast allies. At this point, the U.S. treated with tribes on an equal basis, as though the tribes themselves held full sovereignty, just like any other polity, no matter whether or not the politicians themselves viewed the various tribes with disdain. These treaties generally focused on trying to eliminate hostile interaction and cede more land to the United States through purchases. Though these treaties were mostly abided by the United States at first, individual citizens often violated these treaties from the beginning, with the weak federal government incapable of preventing these violations. Hence why many tribes would turn to raiding in response. So the US would seek to create interlocking alliances with the various tribes, whom had always been an integral part of colonial warfare. But these alliances took a distinct strategy, often called divide and conquer. Essentially, the US would seek to prevent alliances like the Northwest Confederacy from forming and be able to play one tribe off of another, which of course led to wars. Cherokees were the first to fight. They had largely taken the side of the British during the Revolutionary War, though much like Choctaws and Chickasaws further west, Cherokees had largely focused on trying to take back Florida from the Spanish, who had beaten the British earlier in the war. But in 1780 through 82, Cherokees started joining in the fight in the southern states. Some settlers had started going over the mountains to push the frontier further west. As Cherokees rose up, these over-mountain men mustered to head west and win the fight. Though most of the fighting of the Revolutionary War was done by 1781, at least in the States, a year later, a whole bunch of partisan fighting erupted in the backwoods, hence why many Southerners called 1782 the Year of Blood, and Cherokees joined in the raiding. But once things settled in 1784, Cherokees chose to ally with their former opponents, the Spanish. This necessarily made them antagonistic with the United States. One Cherokee leader named Dragon Canoe fanned the tensions by campaigning for the extermination of all Americans. At the same time, all those over-mountain settlers declared their own autonomous Republic of Franklin, which was mostly in eastern North Carolina and a little bit of what is today Tennessee. There were also many settlers going into what is now Kentucky, resulting in a Cherokee and Shawnee raiding war along the Coldwater River, beginning in 1785 and going all the way through 1787. So there was already minor Western conflicts right at the end of the Revolutionary War. With the 1786 Treaty of Hopewell, Cherokee borders were supposed to be well defined, but Franklinites disregarded it with abandon. And since there was only a very weak central government, nothing could be done, save for Franklinites fighting their own little war. This developed into a major conflict between Dragon Canoe's followers and Franklinites trying to fight each other into submission. In 1790, what is now Tennessee formed into its own territory called the Southwest Territory, which was eventually admitted into the Union in 1796 as the state of Tennessee. Before that, Americans killed Dragon Canoe in 1792, and after several minor campaigns in 1793, a larger expedition formed in 1794 to protect the Overhill settlements, which was joined by the Georgia militia to attack 2 Cherokee villages and successfully destroy their willingness to raid farmsteads. This Nickajack expedition essentially ended the Cherokee Wars. Instead, Cherokees turned to Americanization, where they tried to adopt American principles in the hopes of placating the federal government, modernizing their economy, and maintaining their own sovereignty. They'd eventually create their own constitution, writing system, newspapers, and even chattel slavery. And for a time, it worked, unlike the Old Northwest. The area surrounding the Great Lakes had largely been conquered by the Iroquois Confederacy during the Beaver Wars. The French and British regimes had to create trade relationships with local tribes that negotiated power throughout the region, where no one held complete hegemony. Hence why historian Richard White calls the area and time frame the Middle Ground. The Beaver Wars had devastated the region, but it steadily came back throughout the last half of the 18th century. Joseph Brant had created the Northwest Confederacy, but a Miami leader named Little Turtle, along with a Shawnee leader named Blue Jacket, eventually took over, aligning themselves with the British, who still had forts in the Old Northwest. Little Turtle started allowing raids on American settlements in Kentucky, even though they were legally created. This escalated enough for settlers to form their own raid into the Northwest Confederacy under Benjamin Logan in 1786. But the cycle of raid and counter-raid continued, especially once the U.S. created the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which allowed settlers to buy land in what was officially Indian Territory, thereby breaking the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, and even creating a fort across the Ohio River in what is now Cincinnati. By 1790, the raiding and counter-raiding had gotten so bad that President Washington sent a campaign under Josiah Harmer to chastise the Confederacy. This failed miserably, leading to a decisive defeat with 120 to 150 dead Americans. Quickly, Washington sent another campaign to follow up on Harmer's, led by one of the creators of the Northwest Ordinance, Arthur St. Clair. As they went further north, near the Wabash River, Little Turtle's Confederation managed to successfully ambush them and drive them from the territory, resulting in 933 casualties on the U.S. side. By some considerations, the worst defeat in U.S. history. Washington, realizing that he could no longer rely on the informal system of calling out militias under a commissioned officer, helped Congress form an army initially called the Legion of the United States, though it would be reformulated in 1796 to the regular army in which we have today. St. Clair's defeat also led to a massive amount of fortifications throughout the Northwest Territory in an attempt to drive the Confederacy further and further inward, and the Washington administration negotiated the Jay Treaty, which essentially ended the British alliance with Little Turtle's Confederation. Nonetheless, on the defeat of St. Clair, Little Turtle escalated raiding from the Confederacy onto the U.S. border. So U.S. legionaries, or what we would today call soldiers, headed north for a decisive win, leading to the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which left little doubt that the Northwest Confederacy was no more. The Treaty of Greenville guaranteed the end of raiding, as well as ceding new lands to the United States and reserving specific lands for the remaining members of the Western Confederacy. A year later, even those fell apart, but one Shawnee leader attempted to pick up the pieces. His name was Tecumseh. His brother, Tenskwatawa, or simply the Prophet, claimed that American influence was inherently evil and needed purification from all Indian peoples. This was another attempt at pan-Indianism, and much like Pontiac, it encouraged a return to traditional ways, though without the rejection of technology. In 1810, Tecumseh left on a tour to unite as many tribes with this prophecy as he could. His brother told Shawnees that they would know of Tecumseh's return because he would stomp his foot so loud that they could hear him. Interestingly enough, as he was returning in 1811, a series of massive earthquakes in the winter of 1811 to 1812 shook the frontier, originating in the New Madrid area of what is now the southeast corner of Missouri. But before Tecumseh could fully return, he had had a serious confrontation with American troops led by William Henry Harrison. This did not escalate into open fighting, but Harrison used this as an opportunity to denounce the prophet. And though Tecumseh told his brother not to do anything, Tenskwatawa stirred his followers into a fever pitch, prompting William Henry Harrison, who was then governor of the Indiana Territory, to send an expedition north, where the U.S. defeated the prophet at the Battle of Tippecanoe. This dashed the prophet's standing and endangered Tecumseh's newly formed confederation. But events elsewhere would turn the entire Republic's eye on Tecumseh, leading to his defeat, for the U.S. would declare war on Britain in 1812. The The War of 1812 is often called the Second Revolution. Though it was a very quick war, only lasting for about 2.5 or 3 years depending on how you count it, Americans viewed this as securing American sovereignty. Though Tecumseh's War was indeed part of the causes, it was not the primary one. Probably the biggest one was British impressment into their navy. This was a standard form of recruitment for all navies, where a press gang would come to a port town and grab up people and force to enlist in the navy. Sometimes they would even do this to merchant ships, and the United States certainly engaged in impressment. But starting in 1795, the British had regularly impressed Americans claiming they were British. It was difficult to maintain positive identification of citizenship, especially with such a new country. From that year to 1812, Brits impressed as many as 9,000 Americans. It was a constant and ever-growing problem, clearly indicating a massive violation of sovereignty. Another problem came from the British not following up on the Jay Treaty. They had remained in some of the forts in the Old Northwest, sometimes even actively trading arms and aiding Indians during their wars. They had even started helping Tecumseh. This was in an attempt to use Tecumseh's alliance as a barrier state between Canada and the US. So this essentially blocked the US from expanding like most Americans wanted. In a republic that's supposed to be represented through democracy, it was intolerable to allow the British to interfere in what most Americans viewed as an internal affair. In recompense, some even loudly argued for the possibility of seizing the entirety of Canada. Though they had tried and failed during the Revolutionary War to do just that, Americans also viewed the British as becoming progressively weaker, because they were fighting the Napoleonic Wars. Though there was a brief period of peace in 1802 to 1803, the British had largely been at war with France since the First Coalition in 1792. They'd been blockading Napoleon's allies, and he'd been embargoing all trade from the continent, leading to worsening fights with British involvement. That obviously was a massive distraction for the British Empire. In 1807, the impressment issue came to a head when the HMS Leopard attacked one of the 6 original frigates of the US Navy, called the USS Chesapeake. They claimed there were British citizens ready for impressment that they had to take back. Their initial volley killed 4 American seamen, yet the US backed down, short of having to declare war, so the tensions kept rising. A year prior, President Thomas Jefferson had refused to renew the Jay Treaty because of impressment, leading to the passage of the Non-Importation Act, which stopped certain British goods from being sold in the United States. In response to the Chesapeake affair, the US passed a full embargo of Britain. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, were fairly pro-French in comparison to their political opponents, the Federalists. But despite being in the minority, the Federalists managed to make enough noise and rattle the Democratic-Republican majority into passing an embargo of France as well in March of 1809. Both of these embargoes were temporarily lifted in 1810 for 3 months, trying to send an olive branch across the pond. But a British rule stopped all trade because technically the US was trading with their enemy, France. So essentially, from 1807, the US had remained embargoing Britain. But the impressment issue remained the biggest problem. In May of 1811, the HMS Guerriere impressed a US citizen off the coast of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. So the US Navy sent the USS President and Argus on patrol to find this ship. Instead, they found the HMS Little Belt and captured that, killing 11 British sailors in the process. War was readily apparent after that fight, but Federalists deeply opposed this because they still hoped to normalize trade. Democratic Republicans successfully portrayed them as unpatriotic, resulting in a massive loss in seats the following Congress. So in June of 1812, the US declared war on Britain. Almost immediately, anti-Federalist riots erupted. New Englanders, though, frequently traded with British merchants despite the blockade as a kind of opposition to the war. In the winter of 1814-15, many Federalists would meet in Hartford, Connecticut, to complain about their grievances during the War of 1812, as well as other issues with the embargoes, constitution, and currency system, to the point that they even mentioned secession, something that would ultimately destroy the Federalist Party. But war was declared, and it would quickly focus on the frontier. Tecumseh's allies and the Iroquois Confederacy allied with the British, and so the first battles of the war focused on the forts of the Northwest. First, in July of 1812, the British and allied Indians managed to take Fort Mackinac, which was on a strategically important island between Lakes Michigan and Huron. They then successfully attacked Brownstown, Michigan. Then on August 15th, Tecumseh's forces took Fort Dearborn, which is present-day Chicago, and massacred the 38 U.S. soldiers and 14 civilians there. The following day, the British took Detroit. 2 more fights at Pigeon Roost and Frenchtown resulted in massacres, killing more than 400 Americans. So by January of 1813, the frontier was bleeding. But while all this was happening, the US sent a force to invade Canada. There were a few minor attempts in the summer of 1812, most of which got quickly rebuffed. A significant attempt came in the fall of 1812, resulting in the Battle of Queenston Heights, with a significant American defeat. That winter, though, there was a successful invasion of Canada, taking control of Upper Canada's then capital of York, which would later be renamed to Toronto. But at the Battle of Beaver Dams in June of 1813, the British managed to push the US back down the St. Lawrence River, partially because a woman rode out in front of American forces and informed the British that the US was coming. So throughout 1813, on the frontier, the US focused on taking back its forts, making a decisive victory on Lake Erie in September 1813, preventing a British invasion, and William Henry Harrison, at the Battle of the Thames, defeated Tecumseh, who died during the battle. This was the end of Tecumseh's Confederacy. It also meant that the US had control of what is now southwestern Ontario. Throughout this time, the British used their superior naval power to blockade the US. Beginning in November of 1812, they effectively blockaded the southern states, which also allowed for numerous slave escapes either to their vessels or Florida. And by the beginning of 1814, the northern coast had been effectively blockaded. In July of that year, they even managed to take what is now Maine, though it was currently part of Massachusetts. So a bit of America was occupied by Britain, and a bit of Canada was occupied by America. That blockade did not prevent the US Navy from operating and even getting into a few battles with British ships. American vessels privateered, as in basically pirating, but the war made it legal, which effectively hurt British trade, an integral part of their wealth. One American ship, the USS Essex, under the command of David Porter, took merchant raiding to a whole nother level. He attacked southward, capturing 12 British whaling ships, and used that fleet to sail around Chile and cause havoc in the Pacific. In October of 1813, he landed on Nuka Hiva Island in the Marquesas and claimed it for the United States, even fighting alongside certain tribes before quitting the place in May of 1814. He sailed back, but got captured. Part of the reason why all this could continue was that the British were mostly distracted fighting Napoleon in Europe. But Napoleon lost the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813, which was the largest battle in European history at that point, and he was finally deposed in April of 1814, going into exile on Elba. This freed up the British to send forces to fight Americans, though they would have to quickly return when Napoleon returned for 100 days the following year. Nonetheless, the British could now attack the American heartland. The Chesapeake River had a major flotilla set up of random vessels to prevent a British invasion. The British blockade had kept them in the river, with periodic skirmishes between the blockade and flotilla. But with 2,500 British reinforcements from the Napoleonic Wars arriving in July of 1814, they could land and start marching up the river. At the embarrassing Battle of Bladensburg, a force of 1,500 British soldiers defeated 7,000 Americans, leaving the strategically important Baltimore wide open. But the British chased the soldiers, who had fled towards the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. And on August 24th, 1814, the British seized the capital, burning down the major buildings in the process. But in an almost miraculous coincidence, a hurricane swept through. With a tornado forming near the capital, the British returned to their ships. They did not capitalize on their victory. Instead, they attacked Baltimore in September of 1814 and failed. This was partially because of a delaying action elsewhere, which allowed Baltimore to be further fortified. The most epic part of this attack on Baltimore was the siege of the nearby Fort McHenry. An American agent named Francis Scott Key happened to be being kept on the British fleet and observed the bombardment of Fort McHenry. The following morning, the American flag was still there, waving proudly as the British had failed to take the fort. Key wrote a poem about that, which was eventually put to song and made into the national anthem, praising the Star-Spangled Banner. So the war was mostly at a stalemate at the end of 1814. The two sides came together in December of 1814 at Ghent, what was then the Netherlands, but is now Belgium. They signed a peace treaty on the 24th of December. The British swore to no longer interfere with the U.S. interior, nor to impress Americans into naval service. The treaty wouldn't be ratified until February 17, 1815, and the news of it was slow to come out, meaning the war continued despite the peace treaty that supposedly had ended it, which allowed for the rise of a star who would significantly change American history. In January of 1813, Andrew Jackson had gathered 2,000 men of all sorts into a ragtag army to head south toward New Orleans, but then returned to Nashville until the British had sparked a different war in the South. Throughout 1813, the Creek tribe had been in a civil war. The faction led by Red Sticks was particularly antagonistic to the United States, so the British supported him with weapons. American militias got involved in July of 1813. A month later, Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims, killing or capturing around 500 Americans, half of which were civilians. This brought Jackson's army back out in 1814. Included in his army was the as-yet famous Davy Crockett and many other frontiersmen. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson's forces decisively defeated Red Sticks in a very one-sided victory, killing more than 800 Creeks in the process. Minor fighting continued into August, with the Treaty of Fort Jackson giving land to the United States. Just a few weeks after that, Jackson heard of a British fort attempting to take the recently acquired New Orleans. In October of 1814, the British had issued secret orders to take Louisiana Territory despite the ongoing negotiations at Ghent. By December of that year, Jackson had arrived, and a couple weeks later the British had made a beachhead, so Jackson started gathering forces, including the local pirate Jean Lafitte. The British outnumbered Americans and were determined to take New Orleans, but the well-defended 5,700 Americans decisively defeated the 8,000 British troops. The Redcoats took 285 dead, with only 55 dead Americans. Minor skirmishes would continue into February when the news of the Treaty of Ghent finally came. The war was over before the spectacular victory of New Orleans, but everyone knew that if the British had managed to take New Orleans, they likely would not have given it back. So most Americans saw this as a very clear victory, even though the US had lost most battles and even had our capital destroyed. But by the Treaty of Ghent, the war was mostly at a stalemate, and Jackson's victory made Americans see the war as a triumph. People were happy with the results. After all, the war had been officially about ending impressment and British interference in the frontier. The goals of the war were successful. So the time directly after the war is often called the Era of Good Feelings, when the new republic had seen itself as having successfully defended itself and sovereignty in a second revolution. Jackson's fame because of the Battle of New Orleans made him a rising star, which he would ride all the way to the presidency. The Hartford Convention had doomed the Federalists for their opposition to the war and suggestion of seceding from the Union. They were considered traitors because of that stance. So as a party, they were pretty much done, leaving Jefferson's Democratic Republicans as the only party in charge of the United States. In the next presidential election, in 1816, had Democratic Republican James Monroe running against Federalist Rufus King, and Monroe won in a landslide, 68% to King's 31%. The following presidential election, Monroe would actually run unopposed, the last president to do so in American history. There were lasting effects from the aftermath of this war. The Era of Good Feelings was also defined by two effects of this war. The embargoes and blockade of the American coast basically required the North to start industrializing so that they could manufacture Southern goods, such as cotton. While there were some factories prior to the war, the embargoes and blockade had immensely amplified that need. The War of 1812 is essentially the beginning of American industrialization. Finally, with the defeat of Tecumseh, Pan-Indianism was mostly dead for nearly a century. The Northwest Territory was secure, and Creeks wouldn't dare to fight a war against the United States again. But there were still some small Indian wars that were ongoing. One particular war would end up involving Jackson yet again. The Seminoles were in Florida, and therefore outside of the United States, but that was steadily changing in the early 19th century. Spain had used them as part of the raid and counter-raid economy that was essential to the foundation of Georgia, and with Spain basically fighting a civil war back in Europe called the Peninsular War, which was part of the Napoleonic Wars. Their position in Florida weakened significantly, allowing the Seminoles to become more daring. The US had been chipping away at Florida for a while. Originally, it had gone all the way to what is now eastern Louisiana. But in 1810, Americans had declared a republic in West Florida, and the United States annexed it into Louisiana. This is what's called a filibuster, where private citizens create an expedition in the hopes of annexing land. They were not working for the United States, but it worked in America's favor anyways. The War of 1812 resulted in taking more land, including Mobile. There was even an attempt to create a Republic of East Florida, but Spain easily defeated that one. In 1817, a mercenary named Gregor McGregor created his own Republic of the Floridas on an island in northeast Florida. It was mostly to smuggle slaves and allow piracy from the pirate captain Louis R.E. Because of that, the US intervened to stop McGregor's filibuster and continued to control the island from then on. Throughout all of this, slaves had been escaping from Georgia and becoming integrated into the Seminole tribe. Runaways and Seminoles became so intermixed, the Americans couldn't tell the difference. Emboldened by the distraction of the Peninsular War in Europe, keeping Spain away, and Americans dealing with the Creek War, many Seminoles joined the Creeks. In 1815, Seminoles created a fort specifically for escaped slaves, which Americans called Negro Fort. They raided out from the fort to attack plantations, until a year later, when US troops destroyed the fort, leaving over 300 Seminole casualties. This was after the Spanish had refused to intervene to stop these depredations. Georgians started raiding into Seminole country to try to find fugitive slaves, so Seminoles counterattacked Georgian settlements, at times led by the Creek leader Red Sticks. In 1817, an attack on Fort Scott massacred over 100 Americans. These attacks in 1817 led to 2 massacres that took more than 100 American lives. So in 1818, General Jackson gathered a force of more than 4,000 people, including many of the Creeks who fought against Red Sticks. They marched south to harass the Seminoles, constructing forts as they went further and further south into Florida. They destroyed every village they could, and even found 2 British citizens, whom they executed for supposedly trying to wage war on the United States. By the end of it, Jackson controlled most of Florida. So in a treaty negotiated between John Quincy Adams, who was then Secretary of State, and Luis de Onís, then Minister of Spain to the United States, the US officially purchased Florida and set the boundary between northern New Spain and the western United States. This treaty came in 1819, just 2 years prior to Mexico's independence. Those borders would hold. Florida came at the small price of $5 million. Over the course of a few more years, the US would negotiate with the Seminole tribe to create the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. Before it was fully negotiated in 1823, Seminoles continued to take fugitive slaves and raid settlements, leaving Florida very sparsely populated. The treaty set Seminole lands deep in the interior of Florida with the hope that they would no longer interfere with American slavery. The US had solidified its control over western and southern lands. Jackson would once again become a significant figure in deciding what to do with the indigenous people of those lands. Numerous wars had defined American relations with American Indians. Jackson would later seek to remove them. The Eastern Treaty period would end with overwhelming force, but that will have to wait for the Jackson era.